Well, good morning to everyone here from Washington, D.C. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American German Institute, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator and host for today's webinar, and which is focused on European and Euro-Atlantic security. The title of our webinar is The Minilateral Turn: Germany, the United States, and post-hegemonic transatlantic security cooperation. That's a mouthful, perhaps, but I think it is really very timely because we are living through, just in the past few days, a reminder of the transatlantic divisions. We see it in the policy toward the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the American initiatives to try to push some kind of a peace deal, which has left Europeans outside the picture, quite frankly. We see it in the absence of the American Secretary of State at a meeting of NATO foreign ministers happening this week, which I have to say from personal experience as a former American diplomat is really an exceptional thing to happen, where the United States has been a leader within the alliance since its founding in 1949. And we see in some cases that the European Union is not exactly at the center of European diplomacy with regard to the policy toward Russia, and so in those circumstances, I think it is really important for us to look more deeply at the political and diplomatic dynamics inside Europe, how those relate to the transatlantic relationship, and indeed for broader global issues. And that's why we are very pleased to have with us our speaker today. That is Nele Ewers-Peters. Professor Peters is assistant professor for European security at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Her expertise is in European security, transatlantic security cooperation, EU-NATO relations, as well as global governance. And with her experience not only at Maastricht University, but also at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, at University College London, and at the Helmut Schmidt University of the German Armed Forces, she brings a really outstanding collection of expertise and experiences that will give us greater insight today. And let me just mention that Dr. Ewers-Peters has been here in Washington with us at AGI as part of our collaboration with the German Academic Exchange Service. So as a DAAD AGI visiting fellow, we've been especially privileged to have her with us. Today's format: it will be a presentation by Nele, and that will last around 25 minutes, after which I will moderate the discussion and Q&A. So everyone joining us today, please use the Q&A function in Zoom in order to pose questions and offer observations. I will monitor those and will come back to them. The more succinct and question-like your intervention is, the easier it is for us to incorporate it into the conversation. So with that, Nele, it's been great to have you with us, and I want to give you the floor.
Great, and thank you so much. I'm going to share my slides, so hopefully everybody can see this. So first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jeff. And secondly, thank you very much to the AGI and the German Academic Exchange Service for the financial support, and also to AGI for having me for the last 2.5 months here. And also thanks to Maastricht University for allowing me and giving me time and space to do my field research here in the United States. So without further ado, I'd like to just jump into a couple of observations that I had that led me to this talk. So I've been interested in minilateral security cooperation for some time now, and excuse to the all Americans here that I call it the post-hegemonic transatlantic security cooperation. It just comes from some of my observations that I had over the last couple of years. And I will explain how and why I came to this title in a moment. So first, let me start with some observations. And for those of you who are familiar with European Euro-Atlantic Security Cooperation, you might have seen these kind of media coverages where you see a couple of European states coming together. So here you see it's the groups of the Nordics coming together for a meeting and giving the press conference afterwards. Sometimes the Nordics also meet up in the format of the Nordic and the Baltics, where you have either the head of or the leaders of each country, or the defense ministers or the foreign ministers meeting up and discussing in smaller formats. We also have equally seen this more recently, these four gentlemen meeting up, so Germany, France, the UK, together with Zelensky from Ukraine. These three European states or Western European states meeting up with Zelensky quite often to discuss how to further support Ukraine, as just an example. We also have the so-called B9 or the Bucharest 9 format. Sometimes it switches between the Bucharest 8 or the Bucharest 9, depending on whether Hungary is joining. Again, there's another group of states in a smaller format where they meet up and discuss security and defense issues. You might also remember the meeting that took place in the White House in August of this year, where, as you see, Trump had European leaders over, and in this case, not only from several European countries, but also actually the head of the EU, so von der Leyen came over, as well as Mark Rutte, so NATO Secretary General, was actually joining the other European leaders as well, which is kind of interesting to also have the EU and NATO in it. And finally, some of you might have heard of a more recent grouping that has formed in November of 2024. It's the so-called Group of the European Five, so Germany, France, the UK, Italy, and Poland meeting together, also to discuss mostly defense issues, whether it's defense industry or defense cooperation. So all of this has, it's not new in a way. So what I've done for my previous research, or as part of this research program that I'm currently working on, is I've mapped how states in the Euro-Atlantic are cooperating. And here, so you see all the different cooperation formats, which I have obviously inserted in a nice, good software program. And this is what I came out with. So here you see how active some of these European states are in so-called minilateral security cooperation. I will discuss this graph in a second again, but I just want to move on with some observations that I had. So minilaterals have always existed within, outside, or alongside multilateral organizations. Think of the Permanent Five at the United Nations Security Council. The Permanent Five can be seen as a very specific minilateral in a way, which is, an existing one since day one, technically, of that internationalization of the United Nations. Think of also other smaller groups that meet up. So when we hear, for example, in NATO, we have the so-called Euroquad, or for Americans here in the room, you might have heard about AUKUS quite often, also recently, or the Asian Quad. These minilaterals, some of them have existed longer, and then some of them are more new. So AUKUS is more of a new phenomenon. However, what we have witnessed and observed in the Euro-Atlantic, at least, a so-called mushrooming effect. And this mushrooming effect says that there's been an increase of these minilateral security cooperation in the context of greater Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but also towards Eastern or the whole of Europe. And some of them have formed in the context of 2014. So the Normandy format, for example, can be seen as one of these minilaterals. And we have actually seen another uptake of minilaterals in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine since 2022. And well, in my research, I looked at the motivations. So what motivates states to create these minilaterals? And because some of them are created by various of these states, and also based on diverging rationales and objectives. So some of these minilaterals focus more on the defense industrial side. Some look at just supporting Ukraine. Think of the coalition of the willing for Ukraine. That can be seen as another minilateral technically. So yeah, these minilaterals have different focus actually. And also another observation that I had when I did my mapping exercise was that there are different levels of engagement by these by states in these minilaterals. As you can see, some were kind of smaller, some were larger. So this is how active they are. So again, here, so for today, I therefore like to discuss first what is actually Minilateral Security Cooperation, to give you a little overview of what I'm talking about or what I will be talking about for the next 20 minutes. I will also outline my puzzle and the assumptions that I have to see whether I can prove them or not. And then I'll talk about two cases. So what I'm interested in is the US on the one hand and Germany on the other hand. A little disclaimer though, I've so far done my field work here in the US on the United States. I will do so next year on Germany. So I haven't got yet all my data on Germany, unfortunately. But I still want to give you like an overview of Germany's engagement so far. And then finally, we'll discuss some implications. So what do these minilaterals mean for European security and European security organizations? So as I said, there's a few observations, but to understand what I'm talking about today, I'd like to talk to you about what is minilateral security cooperation. And it is really a bit of a tricky phenomenon. So when I discuss it with my colleagues as well, we always disagree on the actual number. So some argue it has to be at least 3 or more states, and the more part can be up to 10, or some even argue 15 participating states. And these cooperate specifically on security and defense issues. These are not necessarily institutionalized frameworks, but these can be so it's optional to be an institutionalized framework. Think of the Nordics that I mentioned earlier. These are more of an institutionalized minilateral. Think of the group of the European Five, who have met up a few times only. This is a less institutionalized framework. What is very characteristic for these minilaterals is that they're issue specific, and here, what is meant is that they are looking at one specific question, one problem, one issue. They're goal-oriented, whereas some multilateral organizations is more like a catch-all. Let's all cooperate. Yes, we want to reduce transaction costs. But for minilaterals, it's about we have a joint goal. Once this is achieved, the minilateral might dissolve. They're also exclusive, as you can see. I mean, this group of the Nordics is only part of the Nordics. There's a group of the Baltics, right? So it only includes Baltic states, but not a other European state, for example. So this is one of very specific. It's more of a regional character sometimes, or it's around a specific interest that these states share. Minilaterals tend to be more flexible because of their decision-making processes. Usually, there is no formal decision-making procedures that we see, for example, in the EU or at NATO. And another key factor is that they are they're working towards innovative solutions. So think of the coalition of the willing, for example, to support Ukraine, or think of a more historic example, think of the contact group during the time of the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. These were ways of finding innovative solutions to solve conflicts and crises. And as I said, the proliferation of minerals is not new, but it's more prominent in the Euro-Atlantic these days. And interestingly, and this is also where some of my questions came from, is in the Indo-Pacific region, there's a lot of minilaterals and trilaterals. So the contexts are different. However, we see for both regions an increasing number of these minilateral security cooperation frameworks. So this leads me to the puzzle. So as I said, I made some observations, and when I mapped these minilaterals, I found that some countries are more active than others. And one of the arguments can be that the more powerful states might be also more engaged in minilaterals, because the way of securing their hegemonic role is one way of securing their powerful positions to kind of have all these smaller and medium-sized countries around them. However, in the Euro-Atlantic security, the hegemon, so the US, is surprisingly not the most active in minilaterals. So in my mapping exercise, I'm only active in 2, right? However, and that's what I found very interesting, is that smaller and medium-sized states actually seem to be very active in these minilateral security cooperation frameworks. And some states with specific resources, but also non-military powers, so we're talking about economic powers or political power, they actually serve as these poles or hubs in the network. So they are actually forming a lot of these minilaterals even though they don't have the military power, but they have other types of powers. So coming again to this mapping exercise, here's the US. It's not as active. It hasn't got any, that many connections. It does have a lot of bilateral connections, but not necessarily the minilateral connections. In contrast, Germany is quite central. It does have over 13 memberships in minilaterals, if you want to call it membership. So it is connected to most countries around Europe or in the Euro-Atlantic. And then finally, we also have Poland. Poland actually is equally active as Germany in minilateral security coalition. And you can also see, obviously, France is active, and also the Baltics are generally very active in minilaterals. So again, so this puzzle leads me to two main questions: is what factors drive states to initiate and lead these minilateral security cooperation frameworks, specifically in the Euro-Atlantic, and what are the reasons or drivers for the US and Germany to act through minilaterals, given the different positions, but also both are actually quite powerful. One is more military in the US, and Germany as the economic power of Europe. And I've got two, hypotheses or assumptions, one for the US, one from Germany. In terms of the US, I assume that the US acts through and engages with unilateral security cooperation to foster its dominant position or its power in the Euro-Atlantic and to influence European security issues. So kind of indirectly influencing European security while not actually being a member of it. Germany, in contrast, initiates and acts through minilaterals as a way of bypassing a single leadership role in European security. We've heard these talks about, or these demands, at least in Europe, that Germany should take a greater leadership role. And I argue here that Germany does this through minilateral groups, not by itself, but through minilaterals. So to start with, I first like to talk about the United States and minilateralism, which I think is a very interesting case because so I did talk about 20 to 25 former US officials here across in Washington, D.C., and quite a lot have mentioned similar or gave me similar answers. And they all said, well, the US has a preference for action-oriented approach in security defense. It wants to take, gets the job done, basically. So the US has traditionally a very pragmatic approach to security and defense, but also more recently, as we all know, especially under the Trump presidencies, a more transactionalist approaches. So it wants to get things done, especially for its own interests and its own advantages, which is classic for the US for a policy approach. And for the US, minilateral are such like a formulation of what diplomacy actually is. So having a small, exclusive group of countries with specific powers coming together and deciding or making decisions and conducting negotiations. So for the US, it's particularly interesting to reach out to the more powerful states and not really to deal with smaller and medium-sized states. Also, minilaterals do have to pool resources, and I know multilateral organizations do that too. However, then you have to navigate with, let's say, over 30 other member states. In a minilateral, you only deal with 2-3 other countries, ideally. And this is particularly important in times of stretch and overstretch when it comes to military capabilities and resources. And also in times of greater complexity that we see in the Euro-Atlantic region, we see a number of rising problems and crises which happen at the same time. Some people talk about the poly crisis. So here we actually we have a need for practical problem solving, and minilaterals allow this due to their flexibility and efficiency. And for the US, we have a couple of historical examples. So that's the contact group in the Balkans I've mentioned earlier, 1990s, where it was active. But also the Euroquad, as I said, with France, Germany, UK, and the Quint, that also includes Italy. So other than these, well, let's say 2 groups, since the contact group does not exist anymore, apart from the Euroquad and the Quint, the US is actually not an active member in any of minilateral security cooperation. However, it does reach out directly to other existing minilaterals. So it does talk to the Baltics, it does talk to the Nordics, the Visegrad, the Bucharest. So it does talk to them as a group, which also allows for the US to not having to actually negotiate directly with 8-9 countries, but also these groups can first form their own position and then talk to the US. And as I said, I was kind of also interested in bit in the how the US approaches minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific. And it's kind of interesting because whereas in the Indo-Pacific, the US is very active in these minilaterals, they have been particularly strengthened under the Biden administration, but even now under the Trump 2 administration, they haven't ceased to exist. They still exist. So AUKUS still exists, the Quad still exist. But compared to the Pacific, the US actually has a limited engagement in these minilaterals in the Euro-Atlantic. And also compared to the Indo-Pacific, where it actually has done a big effort to actively building up this network, this hubs and spokes network in the Indo-Pacific. This is not the case in Europe. One argument is that we do have NATO, of course, where the US is a member and is the dominant member. So it wouldn't really need a hubs and spoke network in the Euro-Atlantic. However, we also see that with these problems and challenges and security threats facing Europe, that states have would have a tendency to use more minilaterals at the moment. Another interesting thing in terms of the US is this debate on bilateralism versus unilateralism versus multilateralism. So as we've heard, the US likes bilateral agreements, especially Donald Trump likes his bilateral deals. Bilaterals obviously help the US to directly influence its cooperation partners, but also it can play out as dominant position vis-a-vis others. So in bilateral talks, the US knows that it is the dominant power, so it can play that card. In minilaterals, while the US still might be the more dominant power, given that it's so interested-based and utilitarian, interest-driven, some member states actually are more the driving forces than the United States in these minilaterals. So in that case, the US would face two problems. One problem is it has to convince and influence more than one country in the negotiations. And on the other hand, it will also face their demands, their interest. And also given that minilaterals have a specific purpose, if it's not really part of that or fulfills the purpose, it wouldn't make sense for the US to be in that minilateral. And finally, I call this in terms of multilateralism, I call the US approach a love-hate relationship. The love comes obviously that the US is the initiator and the founding state of very many multilateral organizations and also has actually served US interest. On the other hand, we have seen that not only under Donald Trump, but also the previous presidents have actually left in multilateral organizations over time and during their presidential terms. So here's coming where this love-hate comes from is once these don't serve US interests anymore, the question is, of course, what is the need? And now we also heard that under the Trump second administration is now that the US undergoing a review of its memberships and international organizations. So that's something to be watched out for in the future. And one argument I have is that I actually say that minilateralism and specifically minilateral security cooperation actually fits in quite well with Trump's so-called deal-making foreign policy. So given that the US has actually withdrawn some from non-security multilateral organizations in the past already, the question is whether the US would favor and would benefit from more informal cooperation. Because one aspect of minilateral is that they can actually be informal, which then allows for more flexibility. And also with this flexibility and the interest-driven character of these ones, they fit into Trump's objectives. So he can actually then directly influence his cooperation partners in a small exclusive group of states. And also can play out Trump's ambiguity. So I call it ambiguity. So not knowing what he really wants and what he says and then what he does take action. So minilateral actually gives this flexible framework because for a minilateral, you don't really have to fulfill any commitments because there are not many commitments in minilaterals. And also one other advantage of minilaterals for the US foreign policy at the moment is they bring together like-minded states. So while multilateral organizations usually have a list of criteria for memberships when they want to join and when they're in it. So we have seen more democratic backsliding over the years, also in the Euro-Atlantic. So these minilaterals help to bring together countries who, share certain norms and values as well, but also specifically certain goals and objectives. So here, mini-LETs are not always built based on same norms and values, but rather on goals, objectives, and interests. And another thing that minilaterals can be useful and can serve the U.S. Foreign policy is that they help to advance U.S. interests, but also controlling partners. As I said earlier, you meet up in 3-4 countries. You kind of try to exert influence over them, and this is also how you control them a bit. And this is also something you can also control your rivals through minilaterals, because think of minilaterals are formed vis-a-vis an adversary. And this is obviously something more for the Indo-Pacific. Think of any minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific that the US has created to face the rise of China. Think of the minilateral between the US, Japan, and South Korea vis-a-vis China. This is a way of controlling your rivals as well. It is less so the case in Europe because, well, Europe is obviously more friendly in that regard. And another interesting thing is, this comes from the research on alliances, is that minilaterals also prevent the formation of counter minilaterals or counter coalitions against oneself. So here the US can actively engage in these minilaterals to counter the fact that other states might form minilaterals against the US. Now, coming off to Germany, and as I said earlier, I haven't done my data collection yet on Germany, so I'm going to talk to people next year. But a few observations are in place, and I'd like to present some of the finds I've already had so far. Is one thing that that it's very prominent and has been prominent in European security is this call for German leadership therein. And Germany has not really responded in a way that a lot of allies and partners would want to see and have. However, Germany is very active, not only at the multilateral level, but also at the minilateral level. So it has, as I said, 13 to 14 membership or connections in minilaterals, and primarily with its neighboring states, so Poland and France, but also with other main powers, US, UK, and Italy. But also interestingly, for my mapping exercise, what I did was Germany actually reaches out to almost all countries in the whole of Europe. So it does have its connections to the southern states, to the eastern states, to the northern states, and also to obviously the other Western and Central European states. Whereas some of the other minilaterals are usually formed around the regional issues. Germany is spreading it out. So here, that's where my argument comes from, that Germany bypasses leadership role, or having a single leadership role, because it has its hands in all of these minilaterals, so it can do so through them. And also another interesting observation was that it engaged in both political minilaterals, so more on the defense political cooperation, and on defense industrial cooperation. So it does so to, some of these projects might not be fruitful in a way when it comes to defense industry. One of the membership it has or initiated was a coalition on procuring drones and bidding on drones. So it's actually Germany driven in a way. So that's very interesting. But also interesting, however, though, is that Germany is not the initiator of the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. That is a Franco-British endeavor. However, it has joined that coalition nevertheless. And also Germany has, and when I did my mapping exercise, I looked at them. I looked at when they were initiated. It was usually taking place in the context of some sort of crisis or some kind of uncertainty in Europe. So here we've got 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and Russia's aggression. We also have a 2016 with Brexit and Trump's first presidency, where Germany got more active and said, okay, we have to act, we have to do something, but in a multilateral context. And finally, it's in 2022, of course, when we've seen an overall greater proliferation of minilaterals. So as I said, I haven't got my data yet, so I can't tell you from the insights. However, for Germany, and I talked to some Americans about this, what they think, and I got some answers, and the following answers. Minilaterals are seen as a cover for Germany, so they can actually cover themselves up and say, we're not doing it by ourselves, but we rather do it with our friends, with our allies, with our partners. And again, we see Germany acting behind the scene or leading from the middle, as we've seen it during the Merkel years. So it has happened again, where Germany, as we've seen that photo from earlier, where Merz has presented himself with Starmer and Macron and Zelensky. So again, leading from the middle with two other bigger powers and alongside Ukraine. So this leads me to some implications, some initial implications for European security and European securitizations. So overall, minilaterals present themselves as useful cooperation frameworks, especially in times of crisis, when we cannot find agreement, we can't find a consensus at NATO or the EU. But we have seen greater consensus at the EU level and at NATO level in 2022 in support of Ukraine. We see that when crumbling, especially countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, they've all obviously have their own interests, so they also have their own veto rights. So here, minilaterals are very useful to get things done, and they help to overcome this consensus problem on these political deadlocks. We also, on the other hand, see a risk of fragmentation in the Euro-Atlantic. So think of all these minilaterals and how they work in parallel. Doesn't mean that they always talk to each other and they pursue the same goals, and whether its goals actually are any beneficial for NATO or the EU. And this has the potential of undermining NATO and the EU as the primary security relations in Europe. So if states were to only ask for minilaterals, what does this mean for NATO as a whole and coherence and consensus at NATO and the EU? So here we actually see some risk of that one crumbling. So just to conclude, minilaterals in Euro-Atlantic are here to stay in the first place because they help to get things done, especially in times of crisis or also when we have a lack of trust that we see across the Atlantic. Some of the key drivers of minilaterals are that they are interest-driven, utilitarian, they're very pragmatic, they're very flexible and very efficient. So that's why states have a preference at the moment to use minilaterals over multilateral relations. However, states across the Euro-Atlantic, they have different motivations or rationales to use these minilaterals, and Germany and the US are just two examples. While the US used them to foster its role and its prominent position, given there's a lack of trust towards the US, again, given that the US has shifted its own focus towards other regions now, more in the Western Hemisphere, it can still use these minilateral, especially the Euro Quad with Germany, France, and the UK, to actually still express its own interest for the Euro-Atlantic and to exert its influence there. Germany, on the other hand, would use them to bypass its leadership role, to have this prominent role, and just to do it always with its best friends together. So much depends on the use of different cooperation frameworks and also how to use bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral cooperation at the same time. And with that one, I'll stop my presentation and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Nele. That was a great presentation, and I really appreciated the depth on different types of formats and their effects, and in particular the different motivations of participants in multilateral security cooperation. At this point, I'd like to encourage everyone participating. If you have an observation, a question, a comment, please use the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We all know the drill. So please do that, and I will monitor the Q&A box and bring in those issues. And while people are thinking about their questions, Nele, I wanted to start with one or two of my own. The first one, you alluded to the fact that minilateral security cooperation, it is in a way a tool for balancing, especially when the countries involved lack the weight on their own to make an impact on whatever challenge they see. And so I think about, if you go back a little bit further, there are not very many examples of countries in the Euro-Atlantic community mobilizing minilateral security cooperation to oppose the United States. Perhaps one of the best the examples that comes to mind was around the time of the Iraq War, where you had the what was derided by the United States and its partners as the chocolate summit of France, Germany, and Belgium in early 2023, or sorry, 2003, excuse me. Um, and so I wonder what you see as the opportunities or the potential for those kinds of, you might even call them adversarial, minilateral security cooperation formats to arise for a particular purpose.
That's an interesting point. I mean, yes, true, the chocolate summit was the most prominent case from 2003, but I think for some reason, I think the group of the European Five that has formed after the election of Donald Trump last year can be potentially seen as another, well, I wouldn't say adversarial minilateral, but another kind of counterbalancing minilateral for European and Euro-Atlantic security. Um, I think generally what the US does, it does a good job in reaching out to these multilaterals to avoid any rival multilaterals to show up and also to influence these multilaterals. So you can think of when the US reached out to the Baltics and the Nordics and to discuss issues on Ukraine, on Russia. It also you can talk about the I mean it's a one-off meeting, so we'll see. When as I said earlier, when Donald Trump invited European leaders to the White House. So this also helps the US to, influence, discuss, what is the situation, what are the interests, what do we want, and this also allows the US to prevent any of these counter minilaterals. So we haven't seen them really yet because I think that the US does a good job in preventing them and
Mhm.
and talking to other states.
Right. And one of our commenters adds Luxembourg to that group of the so-called chocolate summit. Um, the the other there's a more methodological question in the chat, which I'll come back to in just a second. Um, but I wanted to zero in on a point that was you mentioned at the start of your presentation that that in the eyes of some, minilateral security cooperation is perhaps um, it is just normal diplomacy that like we have known for centuries. Countries form coalitions to achieve objectives. Those may endure or they may be very time limited and outcome oriented. So and this comes to the question which we have in the Q&A box. Do you have a typology of minilaterals? Are some of them, do some tend to be subsets of larger groups? And or some more that might have a regional component? Or how much of them are really purpose driven? The example given is cooperating in the North Sea against attacks on underwater infrastructure, for example. So, how do you plan or want to develop further the understanding of the distinctions between different types of minilateral security cooperation?
Oh, thanks for that question. I mean, I haven't thought about a typology, to be honest. Because I mean, this mapping exercise was already kind of tricky enough to find them actually, because it said some of them are informal. So finding informal cooperation frameworks, you have to go through lots of newspaper coverage to find some of them. Um, some of them are actually, as I said, yeah, purpose driven, right? So these ones are more us looking at the defense industry. So think of the drone coalition for Ukraine. You can think of that one. Um, some of them are more regional. I mean, you got the Benelux states, for example, the Nordics, the Baltics, the Mediterranean states, they meet up. The E3, if you call them, just to, they have the center where the Western powers coming together. So these are regional. So, but the thing is, a lot of these states are engaging in multiple minilaterals across the board. So some of them engage in more defense industrial projects and some others are, and also in more security corporation related ones. And some of them are also long-standing ones. They have grown, naturally over time. Again, the Benelux, because by nature of, you know, being next to each other, they have, meeting up and have similar security interests, similar projects. And quite often also some of the security cooperation was not the starting point of some of the minilaterals. Think of the Visegrad Four that was formed in the context of European integration and how to get all the four states into the EU and into NATO. But now they do talk about, or for some time, they did talk about security and defense issues. So I think a typology might be tricky because most states are engaging in all different types of minilaterals.
Right, right. And as one viewer points out, you also have capability coalitions within NATO,
Exactly, yeah.
which are formalized subgroupings.
Yeah.
Do those also fit in this minilateral
The,
map
the
that you've got in mind?
They do. I mean, minilaterals can basically exist within international relations. They can exist within NATO, for example. And they can also exist outside and have some kind of interaction or around. So, and they can also transform. I mean, again, think of the Nordics. The Nordics started before all these states joined NATO. Well, I mean, not all of them, but all together. So it has always been existed in parallel to NATO, had a different set of interests or goals that wasn't, in their minds. And now that Finland and Sweden have joined the NATO, now the Nordics is one of these militaries that also exists completely within NATO, but
Hmm.
again, also outside of NATO if they wish to do so.
Right, right. Um, you mentioned that your research thus far, this is part of a longer project, and so you've been focused on the United States side. So I want to zero in on that for a minute or two. Um, you talked about some of the ways in which minilateral approaches might be compatible with the orientation or the instincts of President Trump and the Trump administration. But I wanted to maybe widen that aperture a little bit. Do you see differences across administrations, not just the particular administration that is in power now, but do you see differences in how the United States has looked at minilateralism over time? And if so, what do you see there? The Biden administration or before it, the first Trump administration, and then you go back to the presidency of Obama and George W. Bush.
So that's a very interesting question. So yes, there's, I mean, one thing to note is, of course, the number of mail letters we have had over time. As I said, right? So they've always existed, but we have seen this mushroom effect only over the last 10 years. And over the last 10 years, we didn't have that many presidents in the US. So obviously that's a bit of a to consider when giving this answer.
Hmm.
So in the 1990s, right, under Clinton, but also then under Bush, 2000s, we didn't have as many multilaterals that we have today. So, however, during my interviews and the talks that I had here in Washington, D.C., the outcome was that yes, presidents did have a different or did take different approach towards multilaterals. So Bush was a fan. He said also he met up with the Euroquad to discuss issues, especially when it comes to Afghanistan. However, there were some differences, as you mentioned, the Iraq War that obviously split NATO, split the Euro-Atlantic. But then Bush had like this approach to talking to multilaterals, especially those who also then participated in the coalition of the willing in Iraq. So that was obviously one way of discussing. And then under Obama was an interesting thing. I mean, we all know this pivot to Asia, so Obama didn't really want to engage that much in Europe. So, but engaging in Europe was one way was to talk to the Euroquad basically and to engage with them. So he did talk, and they have regular meetings. They also have regular meetings of the Euroquad actually at the at NATO among the ambassadors at NATO. So it doesn't mean that the president himself is actually present, of course, right? But does take place. And then interesting, and someone mentioned that observation was that Biden had seemed to confuse minilaterals and multilaterals. So, as I said, minilaterals tend to be or are exclusive groups or clubs of states, and someone, a former U.S. Official, said basically, "Oh, yeah, but Biden really wants to expand these minilaterals to have as many other states on board to get the support for U.S. actions." I think that wasn't the criticism of supporting Ukraine. So I think that was, makes sense to get everybody in Europe on board to support Ukraine. But also then doesn't really have the effect of a minilateral. Again, doesn't have this flexibility or efficiency character. And then under
Hmm.
Trump, so Trump does meet up in minilaterals, but not very presently. So far, we haven't really seen him yet there. Um, and something I found interesting, and it's something where I look at both the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, is, for example, that the Quad in Asia hasn't actually met up yet at the leaders level, which is interesting, even though that Trump has traveled around Asia already and met up with partners over there, there was no Quad meeting. And also equally, we haven't really seen this high-level meeting yet in Europe. I think the different or the administrations in the US have used minilaterals in a different way. I think Trump rather, or under Trump, it's more that the US is reaching out to these minilaterals, whereas under Biden, it was rather about the US engaging in them or with
Hmm.
minilaterals. So,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Um, thank you. We've got a question as well, which I want to bring up, and that is, can we draw any conclusions from your research so far on the optimal size of an effective minilateral grouping, or is that secondary to the ability to address whatever issue is
As I
on
said,
the agenda?
I've been arguing with some of my colleagues who all work on minilateralism or ad hoc cooperation, and I think that also heavily depends on the problem and the issue, right? So, I mean, I guess the ideal one would be a trilateral, but what would a trilateral serve if you have a problem that affects more than three countries? So, so I guess it really heavily is dependent on the problem, on the security threat, on the issue here. I guess at some point, we a unilateral loses the this efficiency character if it gets too large. If you have too many mini states in the minilateral, we come back to kind of a multilateral negotiation style where everybody has a word and a veto. So there's no perfect size or no optimal size. But I mean, the the smaller the better in a way.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Um, I wanted to, you know, come back to you talked about on the one hand the mushrooming of minilaterals over the last decade. You also talked about the ways in which minilateral cooperation can undermine multilateral institutions or larger formalized treaty-based institutions like NATO, for example, or the European Union. And I wonder if, it seems to me that you could draw that causality arrow in either direction. You could say that the mushrooming of minilateralism is a result of dysfunction in the larger organizations and the inability um, through political fragmentation, perhaps, or ineffective governments in certain member states, or whatever, that dysfunction is what drives the less desirable option in some ways of minilateral security cooperation. If NATO can't do it, then you need to have a coalition of the willing. Um, or it could be that there's a way in which the minilateral security cooperation is arising for other reasons, and it has the side effect of undermining the bigger institutions. But how do you see that?
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the chicken and egg problem, right? What's been there and how does it affect the other? So, no, I think it does work in both ways, I think. So I think what you mentioned first about we've seen that there's so much political fragmentations, diversions at NATO, for example, that on some questions there is coherence and there's one opinion and it's all agreement. On a lot of other set of issues, we see so many different interests coming together, so many different viewpoints, and also different ideas for solutions coming together. And I think, as I said, a minilateral helps to overcome those political fragmentations within a multilateralization. Um, but every multilateralization also has, I mean, it's my argument with where how I see multilateralizations, they have actually grown out of minilaterals. I mean, think of NATO when it started at 12. It's kind of unilateral as well, right? So you have this kind of always this
Well,
club.
but it was a treaty-based organization.
That's true.
Um,
But the treaty is like it's very short, right? So the NATO treaty is very short, very vague, let's say, compared to other treaty-based internationalizations. And so I think that some of these multilaterals work only on the basis of having these unilaterals within, that these unilaterals come together to work on a problem and then reach out to the other members and convince them of their proposal, for example. I think
mhm.
there's been more research done on the EU when states meet up at the EU level, they would always meet up first in the minilateral context, in a small group context, and then find the agreement. And one thing someone has observed is basically that quite often when the Quad in NATO, even though the Quad is not well liked among other member states in NATO, so ask Netherlands, ask Italy, they would not really be big fans of the Euroquad. However, once the Euroquad has agreed on a certain issue or issue sets and policy sets, most likely other members that have often followed. So I've been told that quite often when the Quad has kind of agreed, um, there's more agreement at the multilateral level as well. So
Right.
this is how they obviously interact with each other. Um, but it out for the Euroquad is one minilateral. The question is then if all the other minilaterals do the same thing, will they get the same set of support?
Yeah. Well, that so you highlight this potential symbiotic relationship where minilateralism, I its purpose is to make multilateralism function more effectively, as opposed to being an alternative to multilateralism, which I think is an
Definitely.
important point. And
And just
your point,
sorry to
yes,
add something. It also depends on how a certain state uses the minilateral. Well, it's about the intention of the states. Do they want to support the multilateral or do they want to bypass the multilateral through a minilateral? I think there's two different kind of ways of how states can also steer or the purpose and the use of these minilaterals.
right, right. Well, you refer to the Quad arrangement in a European context. I can certainly, from my own experience, it is a sensitive topic, so sensitive, in fact, that it was sort of like Voldemort. It was the sort of thing you never talked about, because you never want to, give away what might be happening in the smaller coordination format, and um, and you also don't want to, it's implicitly, um, in a way, humiliating for those who are not part of that consultation format, to be reminded incessantly of the fact that others are making decisions or setting the agenda, narrowing the agenda in certain ways. It's I guess it's kind of like my kids say, if there's a group chat, there's always a smaller group chat happening, and from which certain people are excluded, and either you know that or you don't. Um, I wanted to jump from there to the Indo-Pacific um, comparisons that you drew upon in your research. And those have, from a United States perspective, a slightly longer history than at least U.S. involvement in minilateralism in European security. And you highlighted, these differences in flexibility, sustainability, impact, efficiency. Um, and if you were to draw either a conclusion about how American decision makers might be influenced by the Indo-Pacific experience in their view of European minilateralism, or more generally, the overall effectiveness of minilateralism that one can draw from the American experience in that theater, for the European one. What strikes you most?
I think it's hard. It's a bit difficult to obviously draw conclusions in a way because the Indo-Pacific and the Atlantic are very two different regions. They have two different sets of challenges. I mean, we do have some similarities. We have, like I say, Europe was dealing with Russia, the Indo-Pacific and Asia are dealing with China. But there's different kinds of the security architectures themselves in both regions are very different. I just discussed, right? In the Euro-Atlantic, we have these treaty-based, formalized international multilateralization already. So the purpose of these minilatures is different compared to to Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, where we lack this overarching security architecture based on a single multilateral organization. We do have ASEAN, but then it's a very small group in itself as well and doesn't have all the members of that region. And
And has no security function, in
no,
fact.
I mean they might do. I mean they do talk about security issues, but there's no function, right? And doesn't have the capacities and the structures or the policies in place. So that obviously is very different. So let's say the U.S. approaches the Indo-Pacific that way, it might not work for the Euro-Atlantic. And also, I mean, the other case in Asia at least is even though I think the purposes and the functions are different of the minilaterals in Indo-Pacific is. Um, In that region, the US brings together states who would otherwise not cooperate with each other. Think of Japan and South Korea, not the best friends, but the US brings them together. Um, in Europe, on the other hand, the US does not need to bring Germany, France, and UK together because there is Franco-German friendship. The Germans and the Brits are getting closer as well, and they have their own formats to cooperate. So the US is just another power or the dominant power being in it. Whereas in Asia, it really brings together states who would not cooperate otherwise. So that lesson learned can be drawn. It's just rather how to bring in together who have been competing with each other in Europe over history or throughout time. I think that might work otherwise, but not from the Indo-Pacific. And the other reason is, or the other thing is that in Asia we talk about the hubs and spokes um, kind of network where the US brings in together all these trilaterals and minilaterals in this network of US connections, which doesn't mean that all these nodes within have connecting or connections to themselves. In Europe, it looks different. For my mapping exercise, so many states are somehow involved. I think I've hardly found countries who have not been in the same minilateral. So I think there was like hardly any zero connections between them in miniaturals. Whereas in Asia, I think we can find that where some don't actually have a direct connection to each other.
Hmm.
So it's really hard to draw these conclusions, but I think it's just observations on the purpose of them. And I think because the purpose obviously is to for the US to counter an adversary, and I think this can be done in both regions. So in Asia, of course, the US approached us to creating minilaterals to anything against China or to prevent China to have greater influence. And we can see that not as a US driven, but more naturally driven by more powerful states in Europe is this creation of these minilaterals to counter Russian influence, I think. So it's not US driven,
Yeah,
unfortunately, or sorry to say, but it's more the purpose of these miniaturals are very similar in that way.
right. Well, and I think you've highlighted one of these challenges for Germany, which will I imagine be part of the focus of your ongoing research, is the way that Germany acts or seeks to act as an integrative power in facilitating European cooperation as a way of advancing national interest, but doing so in a more um, uh, a toned down way with the edges taken off in order to take account of Germany's history and the sensibilities and sensitivities of its European partners. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that in the months and years to come from your research, Nele. And I think we're about at time. So let me just take this opportunity to thank you for your research here, for your presentation today. I want to thank our viewers for being with us and for posing questions and participating in the conversation. And I want to thank the German Academic Exchange Service for its partnership with AGI in the form of the DAAD AGI Visiting Fellowship. So with that, thanks to everyone for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And thanks again to you, Nele.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.